presenting his lecture entitled Atlas of the Mind, Neurodegeneracy and Pluralistic Ontology. So in 2 weeks from now, December 3rd at 10 a.m. is the next meeting of the Cognitive Ontology Seminar. Tomorrow on Friday at noon, my colleague from CMU, Simon Dedeo, will be giving a talk on explosive truth of mathematical truth at the center. And on next week on Tuesday, I will be giving a talk at noon again for the lunchtime talk, Are Perverse Incentives Responsible for the Replication Crisis? And if you're interested in any of these events, please go to the center's website and look at the calendar, and you can find registration links for these Zoom events. We're using Zoom webinar. If you have a question for the speakers, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and just write your name. And then I will promote you to the status of panelist, and you will be able to ask your question directly. Adina, go ahead.
Great. So thank you for coming again to the Cognitive Ontology seminar series. And our first speaker today is going to be Marco Viola. He's a postdoc at the University of Torino, or Turin, in the Department of Philosophy and Educational Sciences. He works in epistemology, philosophy of mind, philosophy of cognitive science, and he's written extensively about the emotions. He has an edited book called Neural Mechanisms, New Challenges in the Philosophy of Neuroscience that he's edited with Fabrizio Calzavarini that is coming out soon. And he is going to be giving his talk that is entitled A Neural-Based Assessment of Basic Emotion Theory, Accept, Reject, or Revise and Resubmit. Very clever. And welcome, Marco, to the seminar.
Unmute you, Marco.
We can't hear you.
Okay. Thank you very much. I was thanking Adina and Edward and Alex McGee, of course, for the technical help. And can you see my screen?
Yes.
So good. Now, I must also thank Vincenzo Cruppi, who sponsored me, and particularly my air ticket to Pittsburgh, although that was not the most fortunate figure of the history, but still, thank you anyway. Now, this topic, the neural-based assessment of basic emotion, kind of troubled me for years. It's been the topic of my PhD dissertation, and still, I never managed to put up a paper about this topic. And my excuse is that, to quote one of the most influential philosophers of the last century, well, you know, this is a very complicated case. You know, a lot of ins, a lot of outs, a lot of what have used and who, lots of strands to keep in my head, man. But now, thanks to this occasion, I've tried to put up a relatively simplified story to get exactly to the point I want to make. But I'll be any suggestion on how to reframe the narrative will be very welcome. So let me try to ask and answer this question, that is, does neural evidence speak for or against basic emotions? The outline of this talk to get to the answer, or rather to the answers, will be: first, I will act as a historian of science, and I will provide a sketchy rational reconstruction of the debate on basic emotions. And then I will need, since this leads to controversy, I will need to reframe our initial question. And then, with the conceptual tools I will develop, hopefully, in the reframing phase, I should be able to adjudicate some answer to this question. But first, let me begin with the rational reconstruction. Now, as you might know, Paul Ekman's basic emotion theory was straightforwardly inspired Inside Out. You know, the 5 characters we see in Inside Out are 5 out of the 6 emotions that, in one of the most famous formulation of his theory, were considered the pillars of the ontology of emotion. They are from the left to the right: anger, fear, joy or happiness, and disgust, and then sadness. And I there is an emotion that did not make her way to the screen, and that's surprise, which I represent with that jack in the box in the top left corner. Now, basic emotion is an umbrella term. Basic emotion theory are many kinds, okay, and many theories has been called basic emotion theory, and Paul Ekman's theory is just the most famous, so I will start from there, or more specifically, since his thought changed across the decades, I will refer specifically to this paper of 1992, where he presents his theory into a framework loosely inspired by some old school evolutionary psychology. The first of is the evidence on which he builds the ontology of emotion is that he has evidence of cross-cultural or pan-cultural or universal facial expressions, okay, which is arguably inherited from phylogenesis rather than learned, and that's why also blind people display similar facial expressions, okay, and they are shared among arguably all populations on the earth, and that's why also monkeys' expression resemble some human expression, or at least in this case resemble Paul Ekman's own expressions. Now, there's lots of interesting stuff here going on, but I will just tell, to keep the story short, that many people had many trouble on behavioral grounds with this theory. Okay, for instance, if we are true to a naive view of Ekman's theory, the expression of this woman should be anger. Okay, that should be an angry case if Ekman's theory is to be applied straightforwardly. But if we take into account the context, we see that she's just Serena Williams being hyper excited about winning some tennis tournament or something like that. And this is just one of the arguments that were on which the opponents, the many opponents of basic emotion theory, leveraged to cast doubts onto Ekman's theory and onto the ontology of emotion that it comes with. Now, we're not here to discuss behavioral data, though. This is a cycle of seminars about neuroscience and psychology, and especially how neuroscientific data inform the cognitive ontology. So we want to focus on neuroscience, and that's also what has been invoked by Ekman himself. He claimed back in 1992 that there must be unique physiological patterns for each emotion. But my favorite quote is another one. It's the quote from Andreas Carantino, who claims that the holy grail of affective neuroscience is the search for separate and dedicated neural circuits specific for each discrete emotions. Why do I like this quote? You'll see in a moment. First, let me just, it's clear that I cannot go through all single articles, especially in this talk, because there were dozens. So I've just surveyed 7 meta-analyses of the neural basis of emotion that cover the first, say, 15 years of hemodynamic, especially of bold fMRI studies, okay, from 1990 to 2015, and they all converge in saying that no, there is nothing like a straightforward amygdala fear correspondence, okay? Each emotion involves multiple regions, and each region is activated. And of course, that's a short for selectively activated, comparatively more, etc., etc. But in short, each region is activated by multiple emotion categories. So what we have is unsurprisingly, many-to-many mappings. Now, we can also observe that many-to-many should not be confused with any-to-any, okay? Brain regions are not equipotential. And we can find that across different studies and paradigms and subjects, there are some relatively stable networks, or let's call them prudently patterns, of regions. I mean, whenever you have, say, anger, you have 3 or 4 regions that reliably show up, and so on and so forth. Some of them will be shared with other emotion categories, but still we can tell was the emotion activated by some task based on this distributed neural base. Now take these 2 meta-analyses by different scholars, first Viola and Aman, and then Weger and colleagues, including Lisa Barrett, who is possibly the fiercest of the opponents of basic emotion theory. With regard to our Holy Grail, they are agreeing about the shape of the findings. That is, we have pattern of brain activation. And yes, if you turn to their conclusion, you see that the Holy Grail soon turns out to be a Rubin goblet, that is a bistable figure, because the same pattern of findings, that is, that we have pattern, but not specific regions for discrete emotions. Well, this pattern of findings is considered by Viola and Aman as a strong proof in favor of basic emotion theory, whereas Weger and colleagues do not think that it does not support, it fails to provide support for basic emotion theory. So whenever there is some kind of underdetermination and the same data provide different, and in this case, opposite conclusion, there is some philosophical job to be done. So here comes the reframing phase. In order to solve this controversy, we need to make the assumption explicit. Now, in a relatively recent paper, my friend and colleague Juan Loaiza tried to put some order in this messy debate. And he claimed that in order to interpret neural evidence as favorable or against basic emotion theory, or whatever emotion theory we want to defend or to assess, we need a set of criteria. And to make sense of these criteria, explicitly point toward the debate of cognitive ontology, and more specifically, to 3 ways of approaching the debate, which are described by Mike Henderson's field compass paper. So far, so good. So that's where we are also going. As many knows, Mike provides a nice reconstruction on this increasingly fashionable trick that psychologists use. That is, if there's some doubt about the psychological reality of some category, we check brain data and see if these categories are real. But there are, of course, many ways to do so, and I try to put them into 3 approaches loosely inspired by Mike's description. First, we have the conservatives. Conservatives have their own mental category that they want to test based on folk, or more often on cognitive psychology, and they use the brain just as a litmus test, like, are there neural bases for these categories? Are they consistent? If they are not, it's not a job for neuroscientists to reframe the category. They come back to psychologists and they come with a new set of categories. It's okay, so it's at best a confirmatory role. Whereas it's a continuum, not a categorical distinction, but say that the moderates are those who are in the middle of these brain as no role, brain as all the role continuum, and moderates think that neural evidence can refurnish research programs. That is, they are open to both top-down and bottom-up suggestions for reframing cognitive ontology. And then at the extreme toward the bottom-up, we have the radicals. According to the radicals, neural evidence in itself and alone should be able to provide us with new mental categories. And we can take the old categories from cognitive and false psychology and put them in the trash bin, in a sense. Well, in all sense. Now, we can make a game. We can take our copy of After Phrenology and turn, I'm quoting the back cover of this book this time, Because if you see, not only Mike is among the advocates of the radical approach to cognitive ontology, there is also Lisa Feldman Barrett, who, as I mentioned before, is possibly the greater thorns in the back of the basic emotion theorists. She is a fierce radical and she wants a profound radical reform of emotion ontology. Now, these three approaches toward cognitive ontology reform can be mapped onto three ways to look at the basic emotion theory and to interpret Ekman's claims in that paper of 1992. According to a first strong reading, basic emotion theory is a specific scientific theory with very strict claims. And on the ontological point of view, these claims are there are about 6 emotions. And these are all you need if you want a complete taxonomy of all possible affective states. That's okay. And they have these 9 characteristics. Lisa Barrett is more ambitious, though. She doesn't interpret basic emotion theory just as a specific theory with a specific empirical prediction. She also wants to challenge the very principles inspiring it. That is the modularism of a Fodorian kind of modularism, not massive modularism, and faculty psychology. And she is not only a good scientist, she's also a wonderful philosopher, I think, because she is very explicit in quoting Kuhn. She says more or less, look, I know that old paradigms are not just jettisoned because anomalies falsify them. We need more than a single falsification. Anomalies are just forgotten. That's how Kuhn explains that paradigm works. Until you don't have a new paradigm. If you have a new paradigm, you can jump on the new paradigm and forget the old ones with all its flaws. And of course, she proposes all the people in the field to jump on her paradigm, which is the paradigm of the theory of constructed emotions. Okay, so in a way, her challenge to basic emotion is more radical than just claiming that there are not the 6 categories. Although there is another view on the history of science that is less revolutionary and more reformist, if you like, that is Imre Lakatosh view of the progress of science being made with research programs. Okay, as you know, a Lakatoshian research program is made by an hardcore because no scientific hypothesis can be directly falsified or verified by data. Okay, they need some auxiliary exemption. But if you really want to defend some specific hypothesis, this is the engine of your research program, you can shield it from what will seem prima facie as an anomaly, as a refutation, call it however you wish, by putting the blame on the auxiliary hypothesis, on the protective belt, right? Also, on Lakatosh account, there is not a parricide new paradigm that kills the old paradigm and take all the ground, okay, and monopolistically take, all the ground of that field of science. No, there are several research programs, and they are all into this perennial competition to fit with data and make new predictions. Well, this is the kind of this is the account of science that I think more reliable. And if we frame the basic emotion theory Ekman's paper as a paper describing as a research program, we see a core, which is there are discrete affective modules, and we can interpret modules here in a quite conservative Fodorian sense, okay? And the 9 characteristics that he lists as exegetical evidence I'm suggesting seems to support are but diagnostic characteristics, okay? And the 6 emotions just turn out to be the best candidates in this historical moment. But look, they do not inhabit the hardcore. They are part of the auxiliary assumption, okay? So we can jettison them if that's for the sake of saving the hardcore. Now, this should allow me to separate two distinct claims, okay, that are hierarchically ordinated. On the one hand, we have the weaker claim on the top, that is basic emotion is a viable research program, okay? So there are discrete and separate affective modules. This is more or less the idea behind Jack Punk's affective neuroscience. This is also the idea that is guiding Ralph Adolph's and David Anderson's book and research more recently, and it's been defended on philosophical grounds by this guy is Andreas Carantino. But within this view, we can be more committed to the specific ontology, and more specifically to the specific 6 mental categories that basic emotion theory of in Ted Ekman's paper claim being the pillar and all and only what we need to characterize affective life. Now, the moderates are more or less defending the research program reading of basic emotion theory, whereas the conservatives might want to defend the specific 6 categories. It's okay. Whereas, of course, if you're a radical, you just want to see the word burn, or at least the old paradigm burn, and just you just want to demonstrate with neural data that basic emotions are no more viable paradigm. It's okay. So now this distinction between 3 approaches which map on 3 readings of basic emotion theory are all the tools I need, hopefully, to move to the next and final stage, that is adjudicating and trying to give some answer to this question you see up there. Now, a brief recap. We know from data until more or less 5 years ago that from univariate studies, emotion never map onto a single region. That's the same as any mental category, of course, but they map onto patterns that are more or less made up by the same regions across different studies and different subjects. It's okay. This evidence has been regarded as positive or negative evidence for basic emotions, because the evidence per se is a Rubin goblet, a bistable figure like the duck rabbit, you know, depends on how you're looking at it. So now that's the game I want to play in the last 10 minutes of my presentation. Suppose that we have those 3 positions, the conservatives willing to defend basic emotions' very commitments on the 6 emotion categories, the moderates that are content to defend the general approach of the research program, and the radicals that push it further and they test the paradigm in a rather resist or die fashion. Now I'm wondering what kind of data will they need to accept that either bet T or bet RP or even bet P will be verified. Of course, they will all agree that if only we found that fear lives into the amygdala and insula is the house of disgust and so on, they'll be fine for them. We have the region for each emotion and that's it. But this is not the case for emotion, nor for any other mental states, although there might be some caveats. We might talk about it in the Q&A if you wish. What we rather have is patterns, okay? And these patterns, these networks, are said sometimes, are sufficient evidence for both conservatives and moderates, okay? There are plenty of papers claiming this. Whereas the radicals say, what? Patterns? No, they won't do. Now, if you're surprised, if you disagree that patterns do not constitute a sufficiently solid neural base to ground the psychological reality of this emotion, you might be not alone. In one of these meta-analyses, Lisa Barrett's team, Lindquist and colleagues, that was published on BBS as a target article, okay? And many commentators, like, you know, Andreas Carantino, but also Luis Pessoa, they claimed, look, but there are neural bases of emotions. It's just that they are patterns rather than single regions. That's normal. That's everywhere in neuroscience, you got patterns rather than regions. And they claim, and the response of the construction is pretty interesting, and it's worth discussing for a minute. That is, look, guys, we realize that mental categories are grounded not on single regions, but rather on patterns. But it's not like any network will do. It's okay. These are just contingent networks. They are constructed on the fly. I don't know if there's Mike connected, but they are what Mike Anderson in his book calls talons, okay, transiently assembled, etc. Okay, if we want to ground basic emotion or whatever mental category, we need a kind of network that has some more reality, okay, that is more intrinsic to the brain functioning. And what do they mean? What is an intrinsic network? The kind of intrinsic network they look for, and that, if it were seen to support, to underlie a basic emotion, will grant this basic emotion the right to stay, to be a citizen in our cognitive ontology. Well, they mean the resting state networks. So they will accept to provide a new psychological reality to basic emotion if only their sparse neural bases were such that the co-activated regions that cluster together into resting state networks were the same regions that clustered together during the instances of specific emotion. And they addressed this question in this very old study, and they took the activation peaks for each emotion from Vital and Amand's meta-analysis that I recall supports basic emotion. And they take them and wonder, well, where this region, what are the regions these emotion-specific region cluster with? Who are their functional companion in resting state? And of course, they find that their functional companion carve the brain in ways that are different from what we will, from how it carves up when there is some task eliciting an emotion. Okay, so they conclude that we don't have intrinsic networks for each basic emotion. We have just functional network, but they don't count. Now, I've some troubles with that. That might be interesting to talk, an interesting topic for the Q&A. Why should these intrinsic networks stand at the core of the radical reform of cognitive ontology? I mean, I see thousands of problems. Among them, the idea that resting state networks provide the key for the ultimate workings of cognitive function as to meet these problems. First, the very paper they cite is much more prudent than they would like, because Buckner and colleagues claim something like, look, don't reify resting state networks. That might be just one task among other with no special status, okay? But also, we know the resting state networks do not come without thousands of statistical choices. As anything in neuroscience, you need to choose how to cluster them. Many regions belong to several resting state networks, so it's hard to know where to reify. That mirrors the Edward and Joe's objection to bottom-up cognitive ontology. And again, Joe McCaffrey with David Danks provided serious reasons to think that resting state networks can cluster the cognitively spurious activity, or perhaps even worse, if you're familiar with Philippa White's work. It was there in Pittsburgh, and he probably told you about his idea, which I find compelling. The brain, before being a cognitive organ, is a biological organ. So much of its neurovascular activity might be due not to some to task related to cognition in a straightforward way. Much of this neurovascular activity can be due to homeostasis, to maintenance to repairing the brain or something along this line. And then, even if we grant that resting state is a key for unraveling the functioning of the brain, Why should we only care about the intrinsic building block? Why should we care about composite? Okay, because we also need molecules in a cognitive ontology, not only atoms. So in any way, let me say that for right now, the radical position in general needs to be reworked a bit. It might be very promising, but I want to know more about how to put up workable operational definition from psychological point of view. Now, let me ask, we have reviewed evidence from univariate analysis, but do MVPA support resting state networks, support networks for basic emotion? Well, let me check. The most notable experiment addresses this question is an experiment from Sarimaki and colleagues, where they elicited emotion via two modalities, okay, with short clips and with self-evoked a procedure for self-evoking emotion based on memories, okay. They collect brain activation specific for each emotion from both modalities, from several subjects, and they use them to train a classifier. This classifier showed to be able to make a prediction above chance level of which kind of emotion was involved among the basics based on the neural patterns. So, and most interestingly, it showed to be able to predict, say, an anger elicit an instance of anger elicited by a clip, also using data with anger elicited by self-evoked emotion. And most notably, it can be trained with the pink subject data, and it can predict the blue subject's neural activation. So the authors claim that basic emotions have discrete and solid neural bases that are consistent across individuals. So game, set, match, well, just wait a moment, and that's the final point. They also concede, pushed by Barrett and other that made sound consideration, that, well, the fact that we can find neural bases for these 6 emotions does not mean that this is the only nor the better way to look for the correlates of emotions. And indeed, in a proof of concept, they showed that they can find similar sparse neural bases of something like 20 emotion states. And look, we can see that surprise, for instance, which is a basic emotion, has a very high accuracy in this prediction, but love is the second best among the emotion, and it was not one of the basic emotions. So if we are moderates, we shall be ready to admit that yes, there are neural markers for basic emotions, but also for non-basic emotions. And so the idea that there is a divide between basic and non-basic is obsolete. So the only option, if we want to keep all and only these 6 emotion, is to be a conservative. You can be a conservative and say, okay, I don't care about the neural correlates of love. I don't care about love. Okay, I'm a conservative, and we don't love. And we just want to defend the 6 basic emotions because we have psychological valid reasons to think that they are the building blocks of our affective lives. But the fact is that at some point, the debate on cognitive ontology, especially if you are a conservative, should go back to psychology. Because if you think that there's few work that can be done on neuroscientific ground, at least you have to provide strong behavioral evidence for your categories. And to make a long story short, almost nobody today thinks that there are special behavioral ground for defending these 6 emotions. And even those who proudly pursue the research program of basic emotion say, look, Ekman was good, it gave us good principles, but now we're stopping his obsession with faces. We are looking for cues, for behavioral markers of emotions in voice, in bodily expressions more in general, and we found more than 20 emotions. So nobody defends the 6 categories anymore. And overall, if you accept my assumptions, the field you have to remove lots of possible outcomes, and the only outcome that I suggest until the radicals develop a more complete framework is to be moderate and to pursue the search for a basic emotion and their neural markers, but being open to reform that list. So take-home messages. On a methodological ground, the first take-home message is that brain-based reforms of our cognitive ontology are no holy grail. They are per se a Rubin goblet, a bistable figure. And you can see either a goblet or two faces depending on where you sit, or where you stand on this continuum in psychology as a say, neuroscience as a say, with all the degrees of gray. But for the point of view of effective science, I've tried to show that it doesn't matter where you stand on this continuum. There are no good reason to keep these 6 categories as having a special status rather than others. So we should hurry in updating our database, which too often encompass all and only this emotion. So that's more or less the list of references I've used today, and thank you everybody for your attention.
Thanks, Marco, for this great lecture. So we have 13 minutes for question. Adina, do you want to go first? Unmute yourself.
I'm muted, yes. So thank you, that was really interesting. I guess what it raises for me is the question of whether there are any distinguishable emotions at all, in the sense that that categories make sense. So are there ontologically real boundaries, or should we be thinking of emotions more along the model of the RDoC criteria, where what you have are underlying neural mechanisms that can, interact in many, many different ways, and we should be thinking more in that framework and rejecting the idea that you can draw distinct boundaries between emotions at all?
Well, thank you. I love this question. In the previous version of these slides, that were many more, I included direct comparisons between 2 models, because I, like Lakatosh, think that the science is never theory and data, how do they fit, but it's always relative, a triangular relation between 2 or more theories and data. Which theory best accounts for some properties of the data we have? And I'd love to compare basic emotion theory to its main rival, to the rival account I just mentioned. There is Lisa Barrett and James Russell's, among the other, constructed emotion theory, which say, look, we have a core affect that is and changes in that core affect that is represented by these 2 axes, valence and arousal, are interpreted on the basis of concepts, and these interpretations give rise to emotion. And now, to make a long story short, this longer version of the talk will say that, look, discrete basic emotion system have some troubles finding a stable neural basis, perhaps, but the neural basis of core affect are even worse. And also on psychological grounds, there are some ongoing controversies that I've published about on the structure of core affect, because the idea that you have an hedonic tone that is either positive or negative is being called in strong doubts by people, for instance, Asaf Kron or Larsen, because that model implies that you cannot have ambivalent emotion. You cannot be happy and sad at once. That's forbidden a priori by the model. But there are some data, both neural and behavioral data, that seem to suggest that this is possible. So I'd love to include the comparison with the model you're pointing at, if I've understood what you had in mind, but there was no time here. And when I will do it, I will show that that's a mess, even more a mess.
So can I follow up? Are you saying that?
Yeah, you can. Yeah, go ahead.
Are you saying that there is good evidence against a continuous spectrum model?
No, I'm
Or are you
just
saying that there's evidence against this particular version of a model? Yeah.
That's it. Second.
Okay.
Thanks, Adina. Joe.
Did this work out? Hi, Marco. Sorry that we didn't get the chance to meet in Pittsburgh after lots of good conversations. I wish I was, having a beer with you and Adina and Uliana and everybody right now. Well, maybe not at 9:40 or whatever, but you get the idea. So I have a question about the...
You're muted.
I wanted to get your perspective. I wanted to try something out in terms of the study by on resting state. So the Tulago et al. Study that talked about intrinsic connectivity networks. So one worry that I have about that study is that it seems you could almost provide a reductio ad absurdum of the inferences that they make from the evidence in that paper, right? So they talk about how regions involved in emotions are actually part of these intrinsic connectivity networks that allegedly have some more basic function, like salience detection or attention orientation or memory and autobiography in the case of some functions of the default mode network, which has a ton of functions. And the reductio says something like, for that to be a good inference, does it have to be true that intrinsic connectivity networks, as revealed by resting state fMRI, have to correspond in some neat way to the basic emotions, to the basic ingredients of cognition? So that if you did like a dimension reduction on all the cognitive tasks we do, they are all some combination and recombination of those networks, right? And so I don't know, I just wonder, do you think that that would be a fair, reductio? Because I think I could do that with other cognitive tasks, right? I could say, well, yeah, some people think the superior temporal sulcus is specialized for biological motion or goal detection or social situations, but actually, it more strongly corresponds to this, some other, intrinsic connectivity network. So I don't know, I find that inference suspect on the grounds that it would seem then that, we've got this technique resting state fMRI, it happens to identify 18 or whatever, intrinsic connectivity networks, and you just sort of say that those are, the basic dimensions of cognition or something like that. So I don't know, just curious what you think about that argument.
Yeah, well, I will provide a short answer because the long answer would really need that view you mentioned. I find this study crazy, and that's probably because of me. I'm missing something, but I have the strong feeling that they got kind of drunk about the potential of these intrinsic networks. I mean, a priori, you can guess that if there is something happening in the mind, there should be necessarily some change in the connectivity you see when nothing is happening, provided that rest means nothing, and you have provided good reasons to that. So this study seems trivial. I mean, you can do that from the armchair, possibly you can demonstrate the same output, but this is possibly me missing something. We got to talk about this because I cannot make real sense about it. Is it equally puzzling to you?
Yeah, it's absolutely puzzling because it seems it would be a really radical conclusion if the mind itself had 18 dimensions of variation, and each one corresponds to the networks that you find active at rest. And that seems to be a kind of implicit assumption that they make in arguing that this is true in the domain of emotion. So I don't know, I find it puzzling that it seems like they're saying something that's incredibly radical about structure function mapping that gives intrinsic connectivity networks this enormous weight as the sort of the most fundamental building blocks of cognition, almost, if you read the paper a certain way.
Yeah. In fact, in the recent papers, Barrett is a bit more defensive about it. She made some half steps back because she's also working. So she's probably still trying to make sense out of it, but we'll see. We'll ask her maybe. Thanks.
All right, thanks, Joe. I think I'll take 1 minute to ask a quick question, and then we'll transition to the next lecture. So, I mean, I have a slightly different take on some of these debates, which is inspired by, in fact, my acquaintance with the psychology of emotions. And in many ways, I don't view Barrett as being a very original thinker about emotion. She's just, you know, a warmed over constructivist, and she's rehashing the James Averill theory of the 1980s in a modern context. So, you know, she's sprinkling a bit of neuroscience on top of it, but the psychology of emotions that she has, a very old-fashioned psychology of emotion. And I think what's going on there is that people aren't really talking about the same thing. They're starting with folk terminology of emotion, folk concepts, you know, in English, anger or peur en français, and so on and so forth. And then they're taking that to map onto genuine psychological constructs without taking for granted that, in fact, the word there is no one-to-one relation between English words or French words or Italian words, for that matter, or Bengali words, and the right psychological constructs, right? So what we mean by fear could be mapped onto something quite different depending on, well, how broad we want to understand what fear really is. There's a very nice paper by Stitch and Malone now about 15 years ago that discusses the debate between constructivists and evolutionary thinkers about emotion. So it just makes this very same point. People use the same word, anger, fear, and so on and so forth, but they're really not talking about the same psychological state. And then you end up with these myths about the neuroscience, which is partly driven by a lack of clarity about the psychology. So I mean, my concern here is that many of these people just are not very clear about the psychology itself. So I don't know why. I wanted to know what you think about that concern, which is completely different from the one you've been focusing on.
Well, only a short answer, because that will require, you know, it's a great Lebowski situation again. But many people blame Ekman for positing folk concepts and putting them into the arena of psychology, and then somebody else bring them into neuroscience. Now, to be honest, he was not as wise as Panksepp, who flagged the non-folkness of his concepts by using capital letters, okay? Panksepp affect system are always fear capital, is not shouting, it's just making clear that it doesn't want to mean a one-to-one mapping from his psychological category and to a folk category. Neither Ekman did. He provides some rough, perhaps, grounds for establishing that they are psychological constructs, but his choice not to flag that is unfortunate because he is vulnerable to this objection, which is a misposed objection, I think, but it's partly Ekman's fault. I mean, it was not really interested in theory, so it's doing the interrupter notes, and it just doesn't care about his critics. But that might be a bit ingenuous to blame Ekman for that. Although that's a mess, that's a very complicated mess. Andreas Calentino have written great things about this mess.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have time to follow up. I don't want to blame Ekman, but we'll talk more about that hopefully very, very, very soon. Exactly. All right. Thank you very much, Marco. And Joël, the floor is yours. And I now with this introduction.
Sorry. Edouard, is it time?
Yep.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Okay. So our next speaker is Yoed Kenett. He's the senior lecturer, which is, I guess, in Israeli assistant professor at the Faculty of Industrial Engineering and Management at the Technion in Israel. He studies how semantic memory structure enables and constrains high-level cognitive processes in typical and in clinical populations. And to do this, he uses computational methods to represent semantic memory structure, as well as empirical neurocognitive methods to directly examine these computational findings. His talk today is entitled Developing a Neurally Informed Ontology of Creativity Measurement. So thank you for joining us, Yoed.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Okay, great. So can you see my screen?
We can.
Okay, great. All right, well, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to talk today and for attending. This is a project which is the first step down the path that relates to ontologies, cognitive ontologies. So I'm very excited on behalf of me and my co-authors. Oops. that this project is a collaboration between my lab, the lab of David Kramer from Dartmouth College, and the lab of Adam Green from Georgetown University, and where we try to move towards the first step towards an ontology of creativity measurement, which I will talk about now. So creativity is something that most of us are fascinated about, if not all of us are fascinated about. We all strive to be creative. We all want to be creative, generating creative ideas, be novel, etc., etc., etc. And that's great. But the question is, what is creativity and how do we measure it? In fact, creativity as a scientific field, and specifically from the fields of cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience, was very much on hold and stagnated till about the end of the 1990s, where a very strong cognitive and cognitive neuroscience push have really facilitated forward the research on creativity. And there are two big reasons for why creativity wasn't really studied for many, many years. The first big problem is that actually creativity is many different things. Creativity is related to issues, to topics from play and imagination, all the way to insight and problem solving, art, different domains, etc. So in fact, when you bring together creativity researchers under one roof, and I was in one such event, and they all talk about what creativity is, there is no agreement, because actually people who study creativity study from very different perspectives. So that's one big problem. We don't really know what creativity is. The second big problem that has really held back the research on creativity is the problem of measurement, or the tasks that we use to measure creativity in the lab. Most of these measures were actually developed in the first half of the 20th century and are mostly based on subjective rating of different creativity dimensions. Again, in the last 2 decades, there's been a really big push in cognitive neuroscience research on creativity that really needs very valid operationalized tasks. And there's a growing dissent and discomfort in the tools that we have been using traditionally to measure creativity. This is an example of maybe the most widely used task to study creativity in the lab. It's called an alternative uses task, and it is used to measure the construct of divergent thinking, which is one of the core components of creative thinking. Right? This task is very simple. Participants see an object like this box, and all they have to do is to say, what are all the possible alternative uses to this box, unique uses, novel uses. There's different variants to this task, but they're all very much the same. Right? So when people do this task, just as a short example, demonstration, most times the first response is you could put things in it, which is a great response, but it's not very creative. If we ask participants to continue on and generate more responses, they may say you can hide in it, and then maybe even you can use it as a concept. So consistently over many studies, what is found is that when people are engaged in this task, the responses become more and more creative. And this is the task that is most widely used in behavioral, cognitive, and also in neural research. But we don't really know a lot about what this task is measuring, how it relates to brain activity, and again, what other components of creativity there are. So a few years ago, the Society for the Neuroscience of Creativity was established, and one of its main aims as a society is to advance our understanding of what creativity is and create some cohesion across, again, the various flavors of creativity researchers on the board that mostly study this from cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience perspective. And the talk today is I'm going to describe a project that is just one first step of that aim that we have been working on. So to sum all of this confusion up, and it's a huge confusion, creativity, two big problems. One is, what is it? And when we say what is it, we can ask, what are its key constructs? Divergent thinking, again, is one of them, but there are others, reasoning, convergent thinking, we'll talk about that later. How do these constructs, how can we understand or define them? How can we operationalize them? And also, importantly, how do they relate to each other in allowing this complex multidimensional construct to take place? The second big problem that strongly relates to this is how do we measure it, and how can we match constructs to specific tasks that can uniquely and validly measure these constructs, and this is critical for our ability to, again, to understand and measure these constructs. So from the one hand, we still really don't know what this is all about, and from the other hand, we don't really know how to measure it. And the aim here today was to, in this project, was to demonstrate through an initial, very minimal proof of concept, how we can leverage meta-analytic, data-driven approaches to use neuroscience or neuroimaging data to support an ontological mapping between creative relevant constructs and tasks that measure these constructs. Specifically, we do this based on the assumption that similarity or dissimilarity at the neural level can inform us to the extent to which these constructs relate to each other. And that's as we can say that we are moderates, maybe based on the previous talk. So our goals in this study was, one, to compare a neural construct space with an expert behavioral-based space, and I'll get into that in the next couple of slides. And then to ask how specific tasks that measure these constructs relate to the constructs at the neural level. So how do we do all of this? First off, just talk a little bit about the participants in our study. We specifically set out to collect data from expert creativity researchers. So we went out and we approached the community of two different creativity communities. The first is from the Society of the Neuroscience of Creativity, which we talked about. And the second is from the American Psychological Association, Division 10, which is the Society for the Psychology of Aesthetics, Creativity, and the Arts. And we approached as many of people in these two communities and asked them to fill a short survey with 3 different tasks. And today I'll only talk about one of these tasks. Overall, we collected data from 65 participants. You can see here their demographic information, the averaging across of 10 years of expertise in creativity. So fairly a good amount of knowledge in what creativity should be about. The next step was, so what did we do with these participants? Was we had them look at a set of creativity related terms. These terms we decided on 10 specific terms that are, again, prototypical, strongly relevant constructs or terms that relate to creativity. Divergent thinking is here. We talked a little bit about that. But others, we also have the term creativity because we're interested in general structure, flexibility, generation, imagery, insight, novelty, reasoning, cognitive control, and convergent thinking. So all of these are very strongly relevant constructs that have been studied under the line of creativity. And then participants were asked to judge. They were presented with all possible pairs of the response of these constructs or terms. And all they had to do is judge, again, based on the 7 types of overlapping Venn circles, how much these 2 terms overlap with each other. Okay? For this example, convergence, thinking, and flexibility. And they did this for all possible pairs. This allows us to represent a similarity-based space based on these expert ratings of how much these 10 terms overlap with each other, again, based on these ratings. This will be our behavioral space or structure that we're going to compare with neural data that relates to these terms. To get these neural data, we went to and used NeuroSynth, which is an open access meta-analytical platform that applies text mining and techniques over about 15,000 fMRI studies, and allows to extract for specific terms that you input into it meta-analytic maps that represent the brain activations across these domains, these terms, right? So we extracted these meta-analytic neural maps from NeuroSynth for each of the terms. We spent a lot of time going through and collecting the specific studies that are in this database. So there are over 50,000 database studies, excuse me. But creativity, as I said before, is a small field, and there's only a very few studies, and we want to make sure that the papers that we're using to extract from these meta-analytical neural maps more directly relevant to creativity. Also, we wanted to make sure that we have enough of these papers to build a valid neural meta-analytical map for each of the constructs. So we set a threshold of more than 20 papers for each of the constructs. And that led for us to unfortunately discard convergent thinking. So we remained with the list of 9 terms out of the 10 that we saw before. So for each of the 9 terms, we extract a meta-analytical neural map. And then we turn these maps, which you see here, and again, this is divergent thinking. We turn those into vector arrays and use that to compute the similarity. Oops, sorry. This is the example I'm just going to show you. This is divergent thinking. These are other terms, creativity and novelty, I'm sorry. And then we used, again, the Spearman correlation to compute the overall similarity between these meta-analytical maps of these 9 by 9 terms. Okay? So the more the overall whole brain neural activity of a term was similar to another term, that led to a higher Spearman correlation. So this allows us to extract a term-based neural similarity structure or space. And if you recall, we have this also based on the expert raters. So we have 2 spaces, and we're going to compare them through different directions. Great. Okay. So the first thing that we looked at, we used multidimensional scaling approaches to just plot out the space, the organization of the expert-based model versus the neural model, based on, again, the similarities, either from the behavioral or from the neural data, and compare them. What we see here is, what we found is some similarities, but also some differences. That is already starting to inform, again, the differences of how much then the relation between the similarity of neural activations and behavioral ratings, judgments of these terms. So for example, what you see here, insight is up here, and we have insight here as well. We have reasoning and cognitive control, they're also here too. So there's some similarities, but there's also actually a lot of the differences. Here we have this large cluster of constructs. Again, this is biased by the small number of terms and also by the sample, but it is starting to, again, to allow us to start to infer the potential similarities and differences of the neural and the behavioral levels of these constructs. So that was just the first step that we did. Next, we wanted to start comparing these models one to another, and we did these comparisons across different directions. The first thing is, as I said, we have a similarity matrix from the behavioral data, and we have a similarity matrix based on neural data. We can use Spearman's correlations to compare how much they are correlated with each other. Using permutation tests, we can also measure the significance, and we find that actually, when you just look at the whole models, the 9 by 9 versus the 9 by 9 terms, there is no significant correlation between them. It's about 0.21. So we wanted to dig deeper into that. And that's, again, also starting to inform us that potentially there is a gap between how we behaviorally look at this construct of creativity with how much, again, the neural information is allowing us to infer about it. So we wanted to move ahead, and this analysis only gives us information about the whole matrix, the whole matrix. So the next thing that we did is we started looking at the correlation across the rows, again, to look at the correlation for each of these terms with the behavior and the neural data. Okay, so we can just take for cognitive control just the row and look at how much it correlates with at the full model. And another thing that we did is we started removing terms one at a time and computing the similarities between this matrix without a specific term to examine how much removing a term from this analysis improves or hurts the correlations between them. So this is a leave one out sort of analysis. This is an example, remove here imagery, and then we conduct this comparison, and we see that there's actually an interesting increase in the correlation between the entire map. So we have three types of analysis looking at these term-based matrices. One is the full model, the other is the row correlations, and the third is the leave one out model, which this table summarizes all of this information, and there's quite a lot of information. Here at the top, what we call the full models, again, is the 9x9 versus the 9x9. This is the 0.21 correlation, where we just correlate the two models one with each other, and we don't find any significant correlation. Each of the columns is, again, comparing that row correlation. So looking just for cognitive control, its correlation between the behavior and the neural model, and it's quite significant. So there's quite a match and between the similarity of cognitive control with other terms at the behavioral and the neural level. And we can look at all of these terms. And over here, down here, is what happens when we are doing the leave one out model analysis. And also for the full model, for the entire model, again, comparing this time 8x8 versus 8x8, and each of those constructs separately, or terms, sorry. And what we find, interestingly, is if you see here, if we remove the term flexibility from the model, from the behavioral model and from the neural model, actually now the fit of these two models becomes significantly positive. It goes up to 0.35. And this also happens when we remove the term imagery. Okay, the model, the fit now becomes significantly positive and it's much higher. And we'll get back to that at the end. But this is a way to start allowing us to start asking questions about what is happening here, and whether are we not measuring these terms well enough, or how are they interfering with fitting a model that better relates behavior and brain. If another thing that pops out, I hope, is that there are three sort of terms that are all overall very significant core fitting between the behavior and the neural models. The first is cognitive control. The second is divergent thinking, which we talked about. And the third is novelty. So these potentially are very strongly stable core components of creativity terms. But again, this is very hard to make any strong inferences from our data, which is very minimal. So this is the big first analysis that we did, looking at term-based comparisons of models that are based on these term similarities, either from behavior or from the neural data. But we can ask, how much are the tasks? If you remember, we're building these models based on fMRI papers and that are using different tasks, potentially different tasks, to measure each of these terms. And we can ask, how much are the tasks that are being used in these specific studies changing or affecting the fits of the models and the relations that we see in this table? So to ask that question, and again, to ask questions about the validity of the specific tasks that we should use to study different notions of creative thinking, we and the co-authors of this project, we selected for each of these 9 terms, okay, that we've been constantly talking about, the 3 mostly widely relevant tasks that are used to measure these terms. Okay? So for example, cognitive control, Stroop, flanker task, and the go, no-go task. For divergent thinking, verbal generation task, or fluency task. Okay? So these are just tasks that are widely used in all of these creativity and neuroscience. Okay? Okay. So now that we have identified, and also it's important, I don't know if you can see this here, but there are 3 of these terms, generation, divergent thinking, and novelty, that the consensus that we arrived when we were trying to identify these tasks, we call it the same 2 types of tasks, and that's going to be important in a second. But overall, what we wanted to do as a second step after looking at the term-based analysis was to start asking, can we build a meta-analytic map that is not based on the term, but is based on from the data of the task that is used to study the term. So we go through the same process with neuroscience, and identifying papers that use these specific tasks, and we now use these maps that are based on the tasks and not on the terms. As a first step, we're going to do this just for cognitive control, which you see here. What we do is we keep all of the other 8 based term-based neuroanalytical maps, and we build 3 different models of 3 neuron meta-analytical maps of cognitive control that each of them is based on one of the 3 different tasks that we identify that measures cognitive control. So a flanker, meta-analytical map, go, no go, and a strip. And then we have now similarity matrices that were built by 8 term-based maps, neuroanalytical maps, and 1 task-based map. And from the behavior level, we still have the 9x9 matrix. I hope that's clear. And then we do the same sort of comparisons, the full model, and we see that again, there's no significant correlations between the full model and between the 2 types of data. When we look at the individual, the correlation between the individual constructs, now what we see is that when we build a map that is based on Stroop, that has the most significant correlation between the behavior and the brain, indicating that Stroop is the most valid task to use to study cognitive control. However, if you go row below for creativity now, actually the map that is based on Stroop is not correlating as significantly as for the 2 other ones. So there is some trade-off, but for divergent thinking, again, divergent thinking seems to be very stable, strongly correlated brain behavior construct. So that is one step forward into, again, trying to identify or to examine the contribution of specific tasks and how well they actually measure the terms or the concepts that we're interested in. The next step that we want to do is now so far this slide we're only looking at cognitive control where we're switching the term for a task. Now we want to do this for the entire 9 terms that we use. But as I said before, for 3 of those terms, they have the same task. So we drop them and we went even smaller matrices to a 6x6, where we are only looking at 6 unique terms that have specific tasks that are different that measure them. But we wanted to make this even a little bit more complex, and we have for each of the cognitive control, we have the 3 different tasks that we just looked at the slide before. And for creativity, we're looking at 2 different tasks. And then we're doing all these comparisons again. And we're starting to flesh out small, interesting differences. And this is a very minimal analysis, and we should really be careful about any possible inferences. But the idea is to show that we can use this to start to move ahead into asking specific questions about the mapping of the tasks that we are using to study terms and the creativity domain, and how well do they actually measure them. And that is very powerful in our ability to better understand what task we should use to do research on creativity. So overall, again, I tried to keep highlighting this, and I want to highlight this even more. This is just a proof of concept, which is a very small first step in our ability to leverage these meta-analytic data and databases to look at how well tasks map onto terms. But it is extremely powerful otherwise to set a long-term understanding of what these tasks and terms are actually giving us in our ability to study creativity. And we are demonstrating how, again, using these data-driven approaches based on meta-analytic maps of fMRI can inform us, or kind of tell us something. And the question is what is this really telling us is still needs to be better determined and to conduct follow-up research. But it is starting to tell us something about the mapping of tasks to terms at the neural level with the behavior. I said that before about some potential interesting findings that we have is one is on the what constructs or terms are actually potentially, what are they telling us about measuring creativity as a whole? And potentially maybe flexibility in imagery, maybe we're not measuring them well enough to be able to say something that is relevant about creativity. Maybe we need to use different tasks to ask questions about these specific terms. Or maybe they are not a core components of creativity thinking, And all these questions force us to advance our understanding and develop our theories on creativity. On the flip side of that, we are finding very, very stable, strongly relevant brain behavior relevant constructs that relate to terms and creativity, divergent thinking, cognitive control, and novelty, potentially highlighting the role, the importance of these terms. There's a lot of limitations in our study. One of them is that we are mining neurosynth that is doing text analysis on the whole papers, but actually the resolution in that analysis should be lowered into fMRI analysis. That's maybe for technical details, but there's potentially a lot of noise that we are capturing in the way that neurosynth currently allows us to mine it and ask questions. The number of studies on creativity in neuroscience is extremely small, and that's definitely driving a lot of the noise and affecting the results that we have, which is why I keep saying that we should be very careful in any inferences or interpretations that we make. And even more, we went from 10 to 9 to even 6 types of comparisons. That's extremely minimal, and we really have to be able to move forward. We wanted to, in the study, to have a very short survey where experts only have a short amount of time when they're doing this, but we really need to find ways to do this in a much larger scale and to ask questions about many other types of cognitive terms, constructs, processes that relate to creativity. But again, why do this at all? We think this is extremely exciting in moving forward into an ability to going from a data-driven approach to connect between tasks, to map the ability of tasks to map onto behavior based on this neural data, and also potentially start telling us some interesting things, even though more complicated things from a theoretical constructs on the terms that come into play in creative thinking. So overall, what is creativity? Creativity is a multidimensional construct, and we need to move forward into better understanding and using more sophisticated and computational data-driven methods to study this multidimensionality to better understand the tasks that we can use to measure this, and then also how these constructs or terms relate to each other. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Red, for this great lecture. Adina, why don't you start?
Okay, thank you very much. That was really interesting. I have a bunch of questions. I guess the first one, just to make sure that I'm understanding what was going on in the slides where you showed the behavioral versus the neural data, it looked like there was no cross-correlation between any of the constructs except for divergent thinking. Yeah, exactly. And creativity, is that right?
Yeah, and this is highlighting the problem, because divergent thinking is the most widely used. There's an over-bias in the very minimal amount of studies that we have. That's some inflation here about the relation. Yeah, sorry, you were going. Go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I'm puzzled, because I would think that if you're doing similarities of activation patterns in these different tasks, that you would find correlations between many of these tasks because they probably share different kinds of components. And so I guess I find it surprising. And then also I would have thought that the lesson to take home is that maybe divergent thinking and creativity are not two distinct constructs. But then it seemed like later in the talk you were focusing on those as some of the most important constructs.
Great, it's a great question. So a couple of things. One, we're not using patterns here. We're creating, again, activation maps and then correlating how similar they are to each other. So I would be careful. I would be more careful in that. But what we constantly find. Yeah, go ahead.
Thresholded data there? Sorry?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Are you using thresholded data? I mean, when I look at this, I see very little activation anywhere where, you would expect there to be activation throughout the brain.
Yes, we're doing FDRZ threshold and correction.
I see.
And,
Okay,
and yeah,
that may
and
explain
also, yes, exactly. So, and again, I want to say that there's very few papers that we are using here, and all of this is really weakening all of this, and it is important to keep that in mind about any inferences. The only thing that we find about divergent thinking is that it is extremely significantly correlated between the brain and the behavior. But what is that really telling us is we should be very careful in how we talk about this because of all of these caveats.
Okay, I have other questions, but I think I'll wait until the end and see if, if there's time.
Yeah, so let me just remind you that if you have a question, please click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and just write your name so that I can promote you to the status of panelist. Since no one has volunteered a question now, let me just ask you, you had a somewhat naive question, but I'm curious to know exactly how it bears on the whole project, and then Adina can come back. So, and actually the slide you're showing us here is just the one that prompted the question. So you have this correlation, R equal to 0.21 or R equal to 0.38. Now, and you said the R equal to 0.21 is not very high, it's not significant.
Well, it's not significant.
Now, my obvious reaction is, well, I mean, if you take into account measurement error of at least some of these constructs, then you should not expect a very high correlation, because the measurement error is going to be bounding. It's going to give you an upper bound to the size of the correlation. So 0.21 really might actually be quite a high correlation as soon as you take into account measurement error. And you do also permutation test, and my memory is a little bit vague, but that permutation tests are very low power for finding significance. So really, another way of asking my question is, what's the benchmark? What would be a high correlation? What would be a low correlation, given that the measurement error is unknown, and given maybe the low power of the test you're using?
So I think what's important is to say is significant correlation versus a non-significant correlation. And we're using the permutation test to measure that. Whether these are high or low, we don't have any benchmarks, so we don't really have any expectations. But the permutation said is that potentially, I actually think it has enough power. But just again, to remind, we're doing this on 9x9 correlations. This is a very small sample, so there is potentially a lot of measurement error here for sure. And all we want to argue for is that we can use this approach to start moving forward. And if we could go large scale on this, then maybe we can have more stable inferences where we better control for all of these measurement noises. In fact, that there is a 0.21 correlation. Overall, it could be surprising in the sense that there is such a relation, but the fact that when we remove some of these terms, we do get to significant correlations at the whole model level, and is sort of, this is maybe more of an interesting finding. And what terms are lowering or increasing the correlation, and what does that mean? What does that tell us? We're not there yet at all. We're not there at all.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. So the right focus is not so much the low correlation or the significant, it's just the change as soon as you remove one. Cool.
Exactly.
That's helpful, thanks. Adina, no one has yes, so there is a question. Joe, I will promote you. Give me a sec. All right, Joe will ask a question and then Adina. Joe, your turn.
Yeah, thanks. I actually had a quick question more about how you're thinking about creativity and how your results might bear on it. And the question in quick form is, some scientists think about creativity as a trait and are interested in the difference between individuals who are particularly creative or divergent over others. But others have been interested in particular domains in creativity as a skill that's exercised at a particular time. So in neuroimaging of music, people are interested in the difference between people who are, playing from sheet music versus improvisation, and what the brain differences of things like, you know, going into a creative or improv mode would be. And so I guess I was curious, in your thinking about this project, do you think you're tapping into creativity as some kind of trait that individuals have, or as some kind of skill that we all exercise when we're exercising it, or both? And I'm just curious what you think about that question.
Well, that's a great question. And overall, domain specific versus domain general creativity is a big open question. But at the brain level, research and musicians versus artists versus students, there's constantly a lot of overlap. I personally look at this as from a trait level perspective, and the terms that we're using are very general. But we are going about this asking specific experts that are biased and how they're thinking about this. But overall, I would say that, you know, specifically for me, so just speaking for myself, yeah, looking at this from a trait level, focusing at the core cognitive capacities that facilitate creative thinking. Some have termed creativity as an orchestra of cognitive processes that, when they're playing together in a specific, unique way, that what brings forth the emergent aspect of that is creative thinking. So yes, I think research, a lot of people, well, some people that I know in creative research would say, yeah, creativity is about multiple complex parallel dynamics of different cognitive processes that facilitate and that changes across tasks, contexts, domains, individual differences. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. Adina, do you want to
Sure.
have a
Yeah, so I guess I'm a little puzzled by, so you were talking about the degree to which cognitive control, for instance, correlates with Stroop task, and that it looks like most people are using Stroop to measure this. And, you know, a task is quite different than a capacity or a function. And I'm wondering whether the fact that we're trying to get at this capacity with a single tool is actually taking us further away from understanding what cognitive control is rather than closer, because, you know, you could argue what's happening there isn't just cognitive control, it's all kinds of things associated with a Stroop task, and what we might be interested in is the things that are common to all the tasks that we think of as cognitive control. And so that narrowing down the task base might be exactly the wrong way to try to get at an ontology.
I think that's a great question. And I want to again say an important disclaimer here that all of this is based on a very subset of data that was extracted for under terms that relate to creativity. So this is not about the cognitive control space. This is actually about within the space of neural findings on creativity, how well is the task Stroop measuring the concept of cognitive control as assessed by creativity researchers. So there's a lot of very specific overfitting here that, again, really have to be careful. But then the flip side of that, I think these are two different questions, because what we want to do, because of the challenges in creativity research, is to improve our understanding of what tasks to use. And then there we do want to find a specific task that can really give us the most money for our buck. And that's why we are trying to examine the differences that are caused by specific tasks. But I don't think it tells us anything general about cognitive control. And I want to be very careful about that. It's just saying that, again, with this specific subset of data that we are looking at, what we find is, again, from one thing that Stroop matches on the best to this behavioral assessment of behavioral ratings of cognitive control and how they relate to other creativity constructs. But again, the creativity construct doesn't map on with that model that well. So again, there's a lot of trade-offs. And again, this goes back to how much careful we need to be interpreting anything that comes out at this point, but just as a way to show a proof of concept for this approach.
Great. It's really
All
interesting.
right, so we need to stop here for today. I'd like to thank our two speakers, Marco and Yoed, for their lectures, and we hope to see all of you in 2 weeks from now on Thursday, December 3rd at 10 a.m. for Joe McAfree's talk.
Great.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Bye,
much.
everybody.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. See you soon.